Welcome to Web Summit. Openness is a foundational pillar of the internet. Today's digital world exists because people don't need permission to create for and on the web. Yet in 2020, the internet's openness is as radical and as threatened as ever. To be clear, those aren't my words. Those come from Mozilla's Internet Health Report, an annual report that looks at the biggest of issues on the internet with an eye towards openness and accessibility and equity and all sorts of thorny big issues, important issues. To dig into those issues, we've got some of the biggest names in open source and open web. To begin, Matt, I'm going to throw the ball at you. Let's define some terms for us. Could you explain perhaps open source versus open web and your take on what the relation is between them?
Sure. So to me, open source means that the software is imbued with freedom, and the particular, license that WordPress uses, it means the freedom to use the software for any purpose, freedom to see how the software works, the freedom to modify the software, and the freedom to redistribute those modifications. To me, the open web is the web realization of that. So if you could imagine the concept of freedom extended to your data online, your ability to move between services, your privacy, just your ability to be a sovereign citizen and independent on the web is key and crucial. And I think we need to demand that freedom of all of our services.
It feels like the existence of some of these broad platforms like Drupal, like WordPress, the ability to create freely and openly at will allowed us to create this open web that we have today. But it feels threatened, right? We don't have exactly the freedoms that we're looking for.
I think the threat to freedom everywhere is that we're very quick to trade freedom for convenience. And freedom always isn't easy. And so there's definitely been a proliferation of proprietary web services. Maybe Facebook is a good example of it, but that's not really new. I mean, if this was 15 or 20 years ago, we'd be talking about billboards with AOL keywords instead of URLs. And so I think there's a very natural pendulum that swings between more open and closed. And there's folks like very represented in this room with Therese and Mitchell that like fight really hard for the open web. And we should try, everyone listening to this should try to support their work as much as possible.
Mitchell, maybe we could talk for a second.
Please, I was just going to add a little something there, if I might.
Please.
I think Matt's point about it's freedom sort of comes and goes, or it might be in waves, and that we do see cycles, and the actions that were necessary for open source and the kind of freedoms and open source also meant like what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of community do we want to make? What kind of rights do I want, and what kind of rights should you have, and how do we work together for something productive? That's all in the constitutions of open source communities, which technically we call licenses. And so those kinds of questions also go in cycles. And to your point, Jeremy, I think we're right back in the middle of another one of those cycles of what is the nature of the communities that we want and the information, and who has freedom. Is it advertisers who have freedom? Is it us as sovereign citizens who have the freedoms of the digital world today?
Great point, Mitchell. And I think the question that we're really getting at here is who's responsible for thinking about how open the web is, what we're looking for from the web. It felt like there was a group of idealistic people in this room, yourselves, who helped build that originally. Is it up to the same people to rethink that? Is there some way that we can encourage today's internet users to get involved in thinking about the open web?
I mean, I would say everybody's responsible for that. You know what I mean? And I think governments have a big responsibility here in my mind. It's maybe an unconventional answer, but I think we have to look at, privacy law, which I believe is a big part of the open web, is to have a safe web where, user data isn't abused, so to speak. So I think there's a big role around regulation, things like GDPR in Europe. They're really important, and it's clearly a government role, but I think governments globally also are starting to look at how do we disempower some of these large platform companies, right? Because we can't leave it up to a handful of companies to judge what's right and what's wrong on the web. So I think it's another way that the government is involved, but I also think, technologists, I imagine a lot of the people at Web Summit are technologists, have a big role. And that can be either through contributing to open source platforms like WordPress and Drupal and Mozilla, who all contribute to an open web. Or it can be about investing in some, maybe next generation tools, even things like the blockchain-based technologies that can help preserve an open web. So there's so many different ways that everybody can contribute. I think awareness is a big thing too. Most people aren't even actively aware of some of the challenges, and that is starting to change, obviously, with some movies and shows that are coming out on TV and just media in general. But still, I think to Matt's point, people choose convenience over kind of dealing with the reality sometimes. So I think that awareness is so important, because it's what activates people to change their behaviors and also activate them to help make others aware.
I don't think that's an unconventional view. It's a European view, perhaps. I do worry about kind of the regulatory capture. So well-meaning regulations like GDPR, which ended up just kind of entrenching the duopoly of Google and Facebook in advertising versus actually opening it up for better third-party ads or more privacy-centric ads. And also just the slowness, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but the slowness at which regulations happen. Certainly in the US, a lot of the regulations that govern services like WordPress.com, I mean, some go back to telecommunication acts before like computers were around. Some are from 1994, some are from 2005. I can't think of very many that were after the existence of the iPhone. And so that type of, trying to fit these old laws into new services and new technologies, I'm not as excited about, but I'm super excited about like things you said, like blockchain. So we can build in the sort of way things work into the technology, and then consumers can choose that. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
I'd like to add on to that, if I could, and make a pitch for the importance of technologists and innovation and experimentation to getting good regulation. Like, one of the issues with good regulation, especially in modern topics about data and what's happening, is no one knows. All the data to make good regulation is owned, by a few companies. So it is hard to get good regulation. And I think part of the role of technologists who want something better is to try and build product, help people be aware, give alternatives, but also show that something different is possible. And if you are doing something different, what could a better regulation look like? And so I think technologists also have opportunity and probably, responsibility to help. I do think regulation is coming, more and more, but to make it, as Matt said, regulation that actually helps expand the system and make it broader and not add rules that on their face, look draconian and powerful, but in reality, don't change the system. I think we can do a lot in that area.
Yeah, and I mean, as a technologist, I'm a fan of solving problems with technology where we can. That's my go-to. But I do think we have a big societal issue where, again, algorithms like Google search algorithm can influence political outcomes, or people go to jail or not go to jail based on the results of DNA tests, which are run by software algorithms. So we have software algorithms defining a lot of important outcomes in the world. And one interesting analogy could be, going back a couple hundred years in time, when you had all sorts of diseases like smallpox and what have you, and literally, so many people and organizations started to invent medicine and vaccines and started to sell those, and obviously that went horribly wrong. Because it's not okay for just everybody to sell their own medicine, right? And so ultimately it led to, I think it was Roosevelt that created the Food and Drug Act and the FDA that is now responsible for making sure that medicines are regulated and approved, right? You could argue, like, do we need something similar for software algorithms that have a high impact on society? Is that an analogy that works? Now, there's all sorts of disadvantages to that, but there's also advantages to it. You know what I mean? where we have a little bit more oversight about how certain things, work, and we can hopefully trust things more, just like we trust the drugs that come from, large pharmaceutical companies that have gone through the process of getting their drugs approved, right? So,
Done
Well,
right,
that's the
there's
beauty
a
of open source
fantastic
is you
role for the
can,
government. But the challenge is that a lot of governments worldwide have been responsible for some of the challenges that the open web has been facing, right?
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Matt, you were saying something? I didn't quite.
I think a lot about the sort of tension between privacy and data portability, where a lot of what I think is entrenching some of these larger services is under the veil of privacy. We're not going to share our data with others. They also make it difficult to export, difficult to take your friends with you if you move to a different service. And a lot of these services were bootstrapped on things like access to address books or other things that sort of allow you to bootstrap a social graph or data graph or interest graph or other types of data to build fund services. And so that's something I haven't really figured out because obviously privacy, I think, is probably a fundamental human right, but I don't know how we're going to map that with allowing more portability for things like open source and open competitors.
One aspect of that we think about, maybe I'll toss in and see if it fits, is this actual word privacy and what we actually mean with the word privacy, and does it actually cover enough? Is sometimes people mean maybe the basic of privacy, which is information control of that. But often I find people use the word privacy to mean something more like, am I in control, user agency, and to mean something broader. So it's not just private, don't watch me. It would be much closer to agency, like the data is mine. I may not care if you're watching me, but I should still have control of it and be able to take it where I want and own it and have the attributes of that data belonging to me. Because there's a set of people who are still like, privacy, I don't care. Either I care about convenience or everybody's watching everybody, so privacy is not high on my list. And I find when we spend time with that set of people, the question of, but who really owns it? Or what is ownership? And so I think this word privacy, the aspect that you think is a fundamental human right would be worth pulling out. And the broader question of wherever we are on the privacy spectrum for a particular service or set of data, what can I do with it? And is somebody else doing things to me with the information they've gathered about me? Or is that information something that benefits me that we think of the browser as doing this in the areas that it can, someone is reaching out on my behalf. If you're a browser user, the browser has a lot of your information, and we try to use that product on your behalf to reach out and do things for you. But so many of these services are taking the data to do things to you or manipulate you. And so just to kind of close, like this question of privacy, what do we actually mean? And is there a user agency component to it that's applicable as well?
That's a great point. There's a lot of challenges to privacy as well, and the limits of privacy. How much of your information is actually private, I think, is a very interesting question, especially when you talk about aggregating large pools of data, which can be used for the public good. Where we set those limits, is that something that we trust the government to do effectively?
I'll jump in briefly. One thing about the data that's out there and the aggregation of data and the ability to buy data is that, we'll say the algorithm, can probably predict what you're likely to do in a setting or motivate you to behave in certain ways more precisely than you or even the people around you, right? Like with that, the amount of information and the emotionless, let's just test A and B and see what happens. What exactly is your trigger point? And how do I actually get your trigger point to do something, to buy something, to go out and protest, to be enraged and move to violence? Those trigger points, that the machine learning, the holders of that information are so powerful. Increasingly about individual action. I don't know that we really trust anybody with that. Interesting question, like when we know it ourselves, what do we do with it ourselves? But that question, I think that's the user agency piece. at the deepest level. Is it, how manipulable am I? And are we continuing to build systems, whether it's the government or private, that are so effective at manipulating each one of us when they get the chance, more than the sources that we know or that we're likely to actually understand. So
Well,
I
that's
would
such a
say
good
to you,
point.
sorry, Matt, go
Go
ahead.
Well, advertising is fundamentally about influence and manipulation, and is an advertising-driven economy, particularly a machine learning or AI-driven one, compatible with democracy?
Nothing
It's a
like the
thorny
big questions.
Big question, yeah.
We've had advertising-based economies for a while, and so probably, the effective radio and the ability to meet people, and the effective TV, the effective movies, and certainly Hitler was an early person to understand the effect of propaganda and what could be done. So I think that's not exactly a new question, and the ability to move more people at a time at scale is certainly growing. This one is the ability to move individual people. So I think, the question might be broken down into who's got that information, what do we use it? If we understood it enough, maybe you need companies that have enough information to build responses to that. Is there, what are the tools that might, again, work on my behalf? I'm living in a world of AI and machine data. We know that. What are the tools that might protect me, that might work on my behalf, that might defend me, that might go out and actually engage with other machine learning systems on my behalf? We don't have any of those yet. We're so early. So I'm still hopeful that, to your question, that we haven't reached the end of the necessary end of democracy here.
And I like your optimism, but I feel like even when we know we're being influenced, it still works. So I really don't know the solution there.
Yeah, it's a hard problem. I think one thing, I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but like one thing that could be a helpful small step is I feel like today, like when you sign up for these services, you have to like read through, I don't even know, 20, 30 page, agreements, right? But I think if I look around the products that I use on a day-to-day basis, like maybe, vitamins or food or a chocolate bar, it has literally a small label with sort of the key nutrition facts, like, this much sugar, this much that. Like, isn't there something equivalent? Like, they don't ship a chocolate bar with a 30-page document that explains all the possible things that might be going on when I eat a bar of chocolate, right? Like, is there a way we can really condense sort of the key pieces, like capture this data, does this kind of influencing just on a label? Because I think people look at labels, right? I look at labels. I'm like, wow, it's way too many calories or way too much sugar for one portion. So I'm gonna put that back in the shelf and take the other cereal.
Dries, that's a fantastic idea. And here at Web Summit, we have a bunch of creators and smart developers with a lot of ideas, and somebody out there, I think, should be able to put that into effect. That's all the time we have here at Web Summit. Thanks, everyone.